Afternoon, everyone. It's the afternoon for me. It's been a long, long weekend. As I've been going through the motions, I had a few thoughts I wanted to bring up. It's a little bit difficult to talk about, but I'll see what I can do. And it has to do with how people are treated, how things are done, and how sometimes you have obligations, especially when you're adhering to a higher power. Some people might have this idea that when you're adhering to a higher power, even if this higher power is providing you with all types of riches, benefits, and livelihood. In particular, as we talk about livelihood, bringing your children, bringing your ancestors, I guess you could say, particularly your children, to the next generation. That's a richness for a lot of people. Some of the people that are the poorest in this world, one of the main things that they say that they appreciate is having children and knowing that their children have children, and all of a sudden they're grandparents. Some of them have the luxury of even being great grandparents, but that's not really what this is about. When adhering to a higher power, and then you yourself have people that adhere to you, that listen to you and depend on you, there exists a certain hierarchy. These days, that sort of thing doesn't really exist, but you know, doesn't it? I mean, it exists in the workplaces for sure. I've seen that. It exists among people who are competing in sports and competing in, for resources. We know that. Things are a little bit different when it comes to hierarchies in a more dimensional realm, but I suppose that might be a video for another time. So I want to get back to adhering to higher power. Oftentimes, it is seen in this world that you have people that are less fortunate that depend on others. There's a time in human history, and even till today, that people are considered slaves. They're considered slaves to the system. They're considered slaves in their mentality because they believe in things that they believe. The Bible talks about that all the time. And I want to bring it up. Abraham, as you can imagine, this is the Bible. Keep in mind that lots of people were not counted as people in terms of like, kind of like how the modern day census is done. You know, that some people are just not counted in old times. If you were, a younger woman, for example, or if you were some type of child, or oftentimes if you were a slave, you were not counted. So there's really no telling how many either slaves that Abraham had or did not had. He certainly had what would be, I guess you could imagine, indentured servants. In the modern day, you could say that women back then were slaves to men. I don't think that there's any type of real controversy to say something like that, but you know, I bet you people that were actually slaves might have something to say about that. They would tell you that it's not the same. It isn't, in my opinion. You have this small thing that comes up in the Bible, and this is kind of the part where it becomes difficult to talk to because think about what is known as your duty. In the Bible, and even in modern times, if of course you believe in such things, you are part of a hierarchy. You adhere to the Lord, you adhere to God, and you have a certain set of rules that you must follow. In other words, if you did have an indentured servant, if you did have a slave. And in this particular case, I'm speaking not only for those of there were laborers, but also in terms of women and daughters. You were to treat them a certain way. They were to have status. They were to live by certain means. And it was your responsibility uh, as being adherent to God to provide these standards. In the modern day, people might look at such a thing and, you know, they look upon it with horror. I don't care. Such things, although they exist, they don't exist for the majority of, you know, people, especially in the West. This is the kind of thing that exists mostly in, you know, we'll say other places, other countries that shall not be mentioned because, you know, it might get a little bit political, and that's not the intention here. Um, Wives, women were given away at times. We all know this. Shit, still happens these days. Slaves, indentured servants, were bought and sold, and it's time that I believe we gave a different perspective on these things. As hard as it is to talk about, uh, as you may be able to tell, I kind of feel a particular way about it. Let's start with slaves in terms of indentured servants and actual slaves. You were property, but you were not just property in terms of that you belonged to the person that was your owner, your master, I suppose. You were property in terms of you were something that was given by God to X person. This person was to treat you a certain way. They were to accept life a certain way as per the hierarchy for the greater good. So, you know, or to adhere to the dogma or the religion of the time. Slaves had no possessions. Indentured servants did, though. Some of them, you know, are purported to have had possessions as far as having land. This is not the same thing as slavery as understood by, you know, more modern interpretations as per what happened during the slave trade over at the Caribbean, the Americas, you know, Europe, India. You see what I'm saying? It is very interesting though how, as you read how they treat slaves and they treat women in this particular case, that they had very similar adherences or rules that they had to follow. In the beginning of the Bible, when it comes to Abraham, you might not know these people, and I'm not trying to tell people that they need to go look it up or that it's particularly necessary to know these things. But the idea I believe is important. That's why I'm trying to bring it up right here. Man had a wife. He had women that he was responsible for. He had daughters in terms of descendants that he was responsible for. And there's a very particular moment in the Bible. I'm not going to give out the verses. I'm not here for that, but it goes a little something like this. They ask a man uh, to come over with the purposes of taking on this young woman. Uh, and she herself is asked, will you go with this man? It's interesting to think about it in this sense and bring it up that you could easily make comparison as to how that this woman was treated as opposed to what she is allowed to do and not allowed to do, what possessions she's allowed to have and not, for at the same time for you to be saying, you know, um, will you go with this man, as if to say that she had a choice. It would appear that she did have a choice. The man had to bring, like, what is it, the word, a dowry. He had to bring riches to say that he was capable of taking on this woman. It is interesting to note that though this woman, by modern standards, once again, might be seen as a slave, as property, as something to be, horrified by, that she also had numerous possessions. She had slaves of her own. She had riches and possessions of her own. And when this man came to her and chose to go with this man, she took with her all of these things. This man, as the intention, is supposed to adhere to God, adhere to the Lord, follow the creed. This woman adheres to him, and this woman's servants and or slaves adhere to her, hence the hierarchy. They have duties towards each other, responsibilities towards each other. They walk and or form in units, in groups, each one having jobs. And there is no indication really as to how these people felt in that situation. Perhaps it was never asked, or perhaps they were asked, but it's never written about. Or at least I don't know where I would find that information. Maybe, someone might bring it up to me uh, in time. Not to go too much into what these duties might have been for, you know, these individuals. I'm not going on a anthropology, you know, section right now. It's just the idea about these hierarchies and the powers that are involved in terms of God and, whether or not it's justified that if you adhere to God and you adhere to these standards that you are supposed to, you know, that this is a justifiable thing. I personally don't see it as being justifiable at all. If there are individuals that decide for themselves with their own freedom that they want to live that way, well, that is up to them. I personally would not be against a society that decides, oh, in our society we choose to have slaves and these slaves work here and whatever. I'm not, in the business of telling other people what to do or societies for themselves who, chose to be a certain way, telling them what to do. If that is how they function, that is how they function. But aside from that, all these things is to end up bringing a question of how important it is to make sure that when you follow certain religions or even certain dogmas, whether you be, you know, a Christian, as per this example of the Bible, whether you be a atheist or pagan such as myself, that you separate some of these ideas as being relative for the earth right now, as opposed to what they mean on a more cosmological scale. It could be that certain functions like that obviously must have served their purpose at that time. And now they no longer have a purpose. But it could mean, on a higher level, that there is also such a hierarchy that exists. Who's to say that these planets, these stars, don't adhere to certain rules and certain hierarchies for themselves? As you may know, or may not know, I will tell you right here, Abraham had lots of duties that he had to perform. He was promised that uh, his children and his children would be as numerous as the stars, or as the sand on the beach. That there'd be you know this many of them. Who could imagine what that would mean? is lineage and heritage to think back how many hundreds, thousands of years of heritage or where you come from in this modern day that important? Or is it that it is important because these numerous children and children's children are just all pieces of yourself, as opposed to thinking about it in terms of DNA? It can be hard to think about accepting, you know, these types of hierarchies that you can be born into. How can you accept that you can be born into a position where you're subservient to someone else and someone else, you know, being able to tell you what to do? I guess where I'm going with this is to kind of ask the questions, is any of us truly free? In particular, are women free? Now, I'd like to say that they aren't, but maybe not for the reasons that one may think. I'm not gonna go too far into that one. Who knows what kind of terrible thoughts might come out of that. But are we free? Do we adhere to the laws of the universe? Do we remain free in our death, or do we continue on a cycle of, you know, being born again into this other type of situation where you're forced to work and till the earth and, do all these things in order to survive? Some people might call that itself freedom. You till the earth, you work the earth, you eat. You're free to do as you wish, and you're free to die. Others might say that that is slavery. True freedom would be freedom of the consciousness, for as to say, the death itself, and as you go on to like another dimension, the afterlife, and that is the only time that you're truly free. As it is difficult to think about these ideas that your responsibility towards someone is a form of servitude. If you're responsible for your children, if you're responsible for your wife, your slave in this particular case, is that freedom? If you must take care of them, if you're responsible for your slaves, are you not yourself a slave in a sense? Let's take a look at it differently than what our ancestors used to gain power. And let's use this idea as a representation of what we are responsible for.